I want to begin with a simple confession. I have spent a great deal of my life alone, and I can tell you this with certainty. Being alone is not the real problem. In fact, solitude can be extraordinarily rich, creative, and clarifying. The real difficulty begins much earlier, in a place most people never think to look. Let me ask you something right now. When you are alone, do you feel peaceful or do you feel as though something is wrong with you? If this question touches a nerve, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, because that reaction reveals far more than loneliness ever could. Here is a fact we rarely question. Modern society treats being alone as a deficiency. If you are by yourself too often, something must be missing. If you enjoy solitude too much, something must be suspicious. From an early age, we are trained to measure our worth by how connected, admired, and surrounded we appear to be. But notice what this belief does. It turns aloneness into a problem before we ever experience it honestly. It teaches us to fear silence, to distrust our own company, and to assume that meaning only exists when reflected back at us by others. This leads to the real issue, which is not being alone, but being uncomfortable with yourself. That discomfort does not come from solitude. It comes from the constant habit of escaping your own presence. Most people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of what shows up when there is no distraction. When the phone is silent, when the conversation ends, when there is no role to perform, something unresolved begins to surface, and rather than meeting it, we flee. Here is an argument worth taking seriously. The pain you feel when alone is not caused by absence of people, but by resistance to experience. You are not suffering because you are alone. You are suffering because you believe you should be someone else when you are. This is why people can feel deeply lonely in relationships, marriages, and crowds. Because loneliness is not physical separation, it is psychological avoidance. You can sit next to someone for years and never truly meet yourself. Consider how quickly we label silence as awkward. The moment a pause appears, we rush to fill it with words, sounds, or screens. Why? Because silence removes our defenses. It exposes us to ourselves without commentary. Let me be very direct here. If you cannot sit quietly with yourself for a short time, no amount of companionship will ever satisfy you. Others can distract you, entertain you, or reassure you, but they cannot replace your relationship with your own awareness. This is the central misunderstanding. We believe that other people are supposed to rescue us from ourselves, and when they fail, we feel abandoned. But that is asking the impossible. No one else can live your life from the inside. There is also a subtle cultural illusion at work. We are taught that happiness is social, visible, and expressive. If you are not sharing, posting, attending, or engaging, you must be missing out. This creates a constant background anxiety, even in moments of peace. Ask yourself honestly, how often do you feel the need to justify your solitude? How often do you explain it, defend it, or apologize for it? That reflex alone reveals how deeply conditioned we are to distrust being alone. Here is another fact. Solitude reveals patterns that constant interaction keeps hidden. When you are alone, you begin to notice repetitive thoughts, emotional habits, and subtle fears. This can feel uncomfortable, but discomfort is not danger. It is information. And this is precisely why people avoid solitude. It requires honesty. Not moral honesty, but perceptual honesty, seeing what is actually happening inside you without editing. Let me offer a reframing. What if the discomfort you feel when alone is not a signal that something is wrong, but a signal that something is trying to be seen? What if solitude is not punishment, but an invitation? When you stop trying to escape yourself, something remarkable begins to happen. The mind slows down, sensations sharpen, ordinary moments regain depth, and you realize that being alone is not empty, it is full of subtle life. But this only happens when you stop demanding that solitude entertain you. Solitude is not there to amuse you, it is there to introduce you to yourself. If this resonates, do not rush to agree or disagree. Let it sit with you. In the next part, I want to explore what the real problem actually is, the habit that turns aloneness into suffering, and why facing it changes not only how you feel alone, but how you relate to everyone else. Now let us look directly at what the real problem is, because once it is seen clearly, much of the fear around being alone begins to dissolve. The problem is not solitude. The problem is the constant inner narration that tells you something is missing, something is wrong, something needs to be fixed. Here is a fact most people overlook. The mind has been trained to interpret stillness as emptiness. When nothing obvious is happening, the mind panics and starts inventing problems. It searches for stimulation, not because it needs it, but because it has forgotten how to rest. This inner voice does not appear only when you are alone. It is there in relationships, at work, in crowds, but solitude makes it louder because there is nothing else to drown it out. And so we blame solitude for a noise it did not create. The real issue, then, is identification with the voice. The moment you believe that the stream of thoughts is who you are, aloneness becomes unbearable. You feel trapped with a commentator who never stops judging, comparing, and demanding improvement. Here is an argument that may sound unsettling at first. Most loneliness is self-generated. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you have learned to relate to your thoughts as commands rather than suggestions. You obey them automatically. Notice how often the mind says, I should be doing something. I should be with someone. This moment is a waste. These are not facts. They are habits. And habits lose their power when they are observed instead of followed. This is where many people misunderstand meditation, reflection, or stillness. They try to use it to silence the mind, but the point is not to silence anything. The point is to see clearly that you are not the noise. When you sit alone and thoughts arise, do not rush to correct them. Do not argue with them, simply notice them. In that noticing, a small but crucial distance appears. And in that distance, freedom begins. Let me make this very practical. The next time you feel uncomfortable being alone, ask yourself one simple question. What exactly is happening right now? Not in theory, but in experience. Are you actually in danger? Or are there sensations, thoughts, and feelings passing through awareness? This question cuts through abstraction and returns you to reality. And reality, when experienced directly, is rarely as threatening as the stories we tell about it. Another reason solitude feels difficult is that we confuse boredom with meaninglessness. Boredom is not the absence of meaning, it is the absence of attention. When attention deepens, even the simplest experience becomes rich. Consider breathing. You have been breathing your entire life, yet you rarely notice it. When you do, something subtle shifts. The breath becomes an anchor. The present moment becomes tangible. And suddenly, you are no longer waiting for something else to happen. Here is a call to thought. How much of your dissatisfaction comes from the belief that life should always be interesting? And where did you learn that belief? Life is not a performance designed to hold your attention at all times. It includes pauses, repetitions, and quiet stretches. When you stop demanding constant stimulation, those quiet moments stop feeling like failures. There is also fear hiding beneath the restlessness. Fear of being insignificant, fear of being unnecessary, fear of being forgotten. Solitude brings these fears to the surface because there is no audience to reassure you. But here is the paradox. The need for reassurance disappears when you stop demanding proof of your worth. You do not need to be witnessed to exist. Existence is already happening. When you see this, the inner voice begins to soften, not because you silenced it, but because you stopped feeding it with belief. Thoughts continue, but they lose authority. Now we come to the quiet turning point. The moment when being alone stops feeling like a problem to be solved and begins to feel like a place you can rest. This shift does not arrive through force or discipline, but through understanding. Once you see that the discomfort was never caused by solitude itself, the entire atmosphere changes. Here is a simple fact. When you stop fighting your own presence, aloneness becomes intimacy. Not intimacy with another person, but intimacy with life as it is, unfiltered. You begin to notice textures, sounds, and subtle movements that were always there but overlooked. The mind, having lost its role as constant critic, begins to behave differently. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer dominate the space. They come and go like weather, and you remain. This is not detachment from life. It is participation without interference. At this point, solitude stops feeling like isolation. Isolation is resistance. Solitude is permission. Permission to be unfinished, uncertain, and unoccupied. And strangely enough, this permission brings a sense of belonging that does not depend on anyone else. Here is an argument worth holding on to. People who are comfortable being alone form healthier relationships. They do not approach others as solutions to inner discomfort. They approach them as companions, not lifeboats. This changes everything. When you are no longer using relationships to escape yourself, you become easier to be with. There is less pressure, less expectation, less fear of loss. You can enjoy presence without clinging to it. Ask yourself this honestly. How many of your connections have been shaped by the fear of being alone rather than the joy of sharing? And how might they change if fear were no longer driving them? Another quiet transformation occurs here. You stop measuring time by productivity or stimulation. A slow afternoon no longer feels wasted. A silent evening no longer feels empty. Time regains its natural rhythm, instead of being something you must fill. This is also where creativity often emerges. Not the frantic kind that seeks approval, but the playful kind that explores for its own sake. When you are at ease with yourself, expression becomes natural rather than compensatory. Let me be clear. This does not mean you withdraw from the world. On the contrary, you meet it more openly. You listen more deeply because you are not waiting for your turn to be validated. You speak more honestly because you are not afraid of silence. And when loneliness does appear, and it will, from time to time you recognize it as a passing state, not a verdict. You feel it without dramatizing it. You let it move through without building a story around it. Here is the final paradox I want to leave you with. The moment you stop trying to fix being alone, you discover that you were never truly separated in the first place. You were simply distracted by a voice that mistook rest for danger. So if you find yourself alone tonight, do not rush to escape it. Sit with it gently. Notice what is actually present rather than what you imagine is missing. You may find that the very thing you feared has been quietly supporting you all along. Being alone is not the problem. The problem was never being with yourself. And once that is seen, aloneness becomes not a void but a doorway.